Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff on the NewsHour tonight. A busy first week. The Biden administration continues its flurry of executive actions. I talk with Susan Rice, a key advisor driving the goal of equity. Then, getting the vaccine. COVID infections and deaths in the United States dip slightly, but the sluggish pace of inoculations remains a cause for concern. Plus, cyber threats. We discuss the recent massive government security breach and the vulnerabilities the U.S. still faces with the former head of the cybersecurity agency. And rethinking college. The pandemic prompts a surge in demand for short-term credential programs as a less expensive alternative to traditional degrees.
We have literally millions of jobs that are going unfulfilled, and that'll get worse rather than better as we recover from the pandemic.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
For 25 years, Consumer Cellular's goal has been to provide wireless service that helps people communicate and connect. We offer a variety of no-contract plans, and our U.S.-based customer service team can help find one that fits you. To learn more, visit consumercellular.tv.
Johnson & Johnson. BNSF Railway.
The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, fostering informed and engaged communities. More at kf.org.
And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
President Biden is moving on several new fronts tonight in his latest spate of policy actions. They include boosting COVID vaccine supplies and addressing racial equity. This as the United States Senate gears up to put his predecessor on trial. Congressional correspondent Lisa Desjardins reports.
Rounding out his first full week in office, President Biden took on a long-standing American failing, racial discrimination, signing a series of executive actions. White House domestic policy advisor Susan Rice echoed the president's commitment to expand opportunities for Americans.
These aren't feel-good policies. The evidence is clear. Investing in equity is good for economic growth, and it creates jobs for all Americans.
Mr. Biden targeted 4 areas: housing, federal prisons, tribal sovereignty, and harassment and discrimination against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. The racial problem overlaps with the health one, with communities of color hit hardest by the coronavirus and government response. A CNN analysis of 14 states concluded that white Americans are getting COVID vaccines at more than twice the rate of blacks and Latinos. In the afternoon, the president announced that governors will receive 16% more vaccine doses next week, a total of 10 million.
This is going to allow millions of more Americans to get vaccinated sooner than previously anticipated. We got a long way to go, though.
The new administration is also watching the Capitol, where the U.S. Senate was busy today confirming Anthony Blinken as Secretary of State. Inside,
the yeas are 78, the nays are 22. The nomination is confirmed.
As outside, Vice President Harris conducted a ceremonial swearing-in of new Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. And committees continued moving through a stack of other cabinet nominees. Rhode Island Governor Gina Raimondo as Commerce Secretary, and Alejandro Mayorkas nominated for Homeland Security Secretary. He won committee approval, moving him closer to confirmation. The Senate also worked on its own mission-critical business. Minority Leader Senator Mitch McConnell dropped his demand that Democrats guarantee they would keep the filibuster rule, which gives both parties power on most votes. This after two Democratic senators, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, stressed they would not vote to dismantle it.
We have a higher calling than endless partisan escalation. We placed our trust in the institution itself, in a common desire to do the right thing. I'm grateful that's been reciprocated by at least a pair of our colleagues across the aisle.
Now all sides expect an agreement allowing the new 50-50 Senate to fully function. Majority Leader Senator Chuck Schumer.
I'm glad we're finally able to get the Senate up and running. My only regret is that it took so long, because we have a great deal we need to accomplish over the next several weeks and months.
And there was more news. House managers last night delivered the article of impeachment to the Senate. As a result, senators were sworn in as jurors today for the second impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump.
The Democrats,
Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky challenged the trial as unconstitutional for targeting a president now out of office and his speech.
Who hasn't used the words fight figuratively? And are we going to put every politician in jail? Are we going to impeach every politician who has used the words fight figuratively in a speech?
Paul raised a point of order, but the Senate rejected his challenge on a mostly party line vote. As impeachment moves forward, a growing recognition that it is an uphill effort. President Biden told CNN last night he did not think there would be enough Republican votes to convict Mr. Trump. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Lisa Desjardins.
And Yamiche Alcindor is at the White House with more on the Biden agenda. So hello, Yamiche. We know the president's now been in office almost a full week. Today he was speaking both about the vaccine distribution challenges around the country and about equity. So tell us more about what he's doing on those fronts.
Well, President Biden is ramping up vaccine distribution around the country, and he's also pledging to put equity and fighting systemic racism at the center of everything that he does. On the COVID vaccine and the response that he's doing, he said he's increasing weekly vaccine supply to states, tribes, and territories by 16%. He's also increasing the total U.S. vaccine order by 50%, from 400 million doses to 600 million doses. That means, he says, that there's going to be enough vaccine for 300 million Americans by the summer. Of course, the U.S. population is about 329 million Americans, so that's a big deal there. The other thing is that equity, he said, is important, not just for Americans of colors and Black Americans, but for all Americans. He said that we will have a safer and more secure and more prosperous country if we all get together to fight systemic racism.
And Yamiche, we know also separately the president had his first phone call today with Russia's president, Vladimir Putin. What is the White House saying about that?
That's right. The White House said that President Biden telephoned the Russian President Vladimir Putin and that the two men talked about a number of issues, including an arms treaty that's being negotiated. He also said that the U.S. really affirmed its support for Ukraine's sovereignty. They also talked about alleged Russian interference in the 2020 election, as well as the poisoning of a Russian opposition leader and the Russian alleged hack on U.S. Governments as well as U.S. businesses. That's seen as really important because President Trump was seen as too lenient on Russia and not being willing to really confront Vladimir Putin on a number of issues, including meddling on U.S. elections. So it's seen as President Biden really taking a tougher stance on Russia, which is what he pledged to do during the campaign.
Of course, would love to know more about that phone call, and I'm sure you'll be reporting on it. Yamiche Alcindor, thank you very much.
Thank you, Judy.
As Lisa reported earlier, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell backed away from the standoff over the filibuster last night. While Democrats do not have the votes for it now, this means filibuster reform is still technically on the table. So what does all this mean? Lisa joins me now to answer your question. So Lisa, we heard you speaking about the filibuster. We want you to remind us, what is it and why is it important?
Judy, technically a filibuster is anything that obstructs or blocks legislation, especially in the Senate. But of course, most people know it as senators using their right to talk as long as they want. They can only be cut off if 60 other senators vote for something called cloture to end that. So I think for people, the dominant reference to a filibuster is this from 1939's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where Senator Jimmy Stewart managed to win the day by talking until he dropped.
You all think I'm late. Well, I'm not late. And I'm going to stay right here and fight for this lost cause.
Love that movie. I just can't overstate the importance of this filibuster, because what the filibuster does in practice in U.S. government is it means that there is not a majority rule in the Senate, but instead a supermajority rule. Now, supporters of the filibuster say that's good because it adds stability, that the Congress will not veer right and left due to sudden changes. But opponents say that's the problem, that the Senate cannot really react to the need for sudden change and that it is not governed by majority rule.
I'm so glad you gave us a look at Jimmy Stewart again. We love that movie. But Lisa, I understand you got more than 200 questions about the filibuster today on Twitter. Tell us what people are asking you.
I'm happy we hit some fellow nerds' nerves. Yes, let me go through some of these great questions. First, I want to raise this excellent one. When did the filibuster evolve from the marathon Mr. Smith Goes to Washington to the threat of the filibuster that exists now? This has happened over time, but we can see really the difference is how often the filibuster is used now. If you look at this chart, look at the remarkable rise in the use of the filibuster. This is the number of times each Senate in those years has voted to try and end a filibuster. Some years hardly at all. Now we're into the hundreds. As the Senate has held more and more votes to end the filibuster, this has meant that the filibuster has become a part of everyday life in the Senate. So senators aren't doing these talkathons anymore as much as they're just sort of issuing the demand for a filibuster to close it and going about their business, holding those votes as if it was just a regular, silent, everyday part of life. Another question that we got, another excellent one. Who has benefited more from the filibuster over the years, Democrats or Republicans? We contacted the Senate Historical Office to talk about this. Now, in the early days of the Republic, everyone used the filibuster, but in the 20th century in particular, Southern Democrats used the filibuster the most, and they used it to block civil rights legislation and also legislation trying to change racist power structures. It became part of their operation. And now we know, as it has changed, as it has shifted in the past couple of decades, both parties have used it when they've been in the minority, particularly when we're talking about judicial nominees, as we saw with Supreme Court nominees in the past couple of years. Republicans removed the filibuster specifically so they could get their Supreme Court nominees through. One more question. Has the filibuster encouraged or discouraged compromise? The truth is, what the filibuster has done more than anything, I think, Judy, it has meant fewer large bills have been able to pass through Congress.
And finally, Lisa, tell us, where do things stand on the filibuster, and particularly for Democrats who are trying to move aggressively right now?
Democrats do not have the votes to reform the filibuster right now, but they are still holding out hope, some of them, that even if they can't remove the filibuster, perhaps they change it. So it's not 60 votes required, but fewer, 55 or less. That debate will have to remain for another day. Chuck Schumer is under a lot of pressure from progressives to pass progressive legislation. Right now, he doesn't have the votes to do it because of the filibuster. But that debate, as I say, will keep hanging over the Senate and especially over Democrats.
All right, the queen of the filibuster, Lisa Desjardins. Thank you. Let's dig deeper now into President Biden's executive actions today. And for that, we're joined by Susan Rice, his domestic policy advisor. Susan Rice, so good to see you again. Welcome back to the NewsHour. We heard from Yamiche Alcindor's reporting earlier in the program about the memoranda, executive actions the president is taking around equity. A number of these similar to what President Obama rolled out early in his administration. That was 12 years ago, and even echoes of President Clinton. Tell us how what is going on now is different.
Well, Judy, it's good to be with you. I served in the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and now the Biden administration. And I can tell you that while each of the previous administrations that were Democratic worked to advance racial equity and justice, what we have seen in the last week and the first week of the Biden presidency is something quite different and unprecedented. President Biden, on his first day in office, implemented an executive order that will embed racial justice and equity in everything the federal government does, from how it collects data, to how it allocates resources, to how it assesses where we currently stand on matters of civil rights and racial equity. And it will hold each agency accountable for its results. We've never done that before. And today, beyond his whole of government interagency commitment to ensuring that we put justice and equity front and center for everything, he rolled out a number of additional executive actions that will be beneficial for a wide range of Americans. Combating xenophobia, for example, against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who faced so much vitriol and animosity and even hate crimes resulting from previous leaders' attempts to target them in the context of COVID. He instituted a very important housing regulation that will, or excuse me, order that would lead to new housing regulations, quite likely, that would roll back what Donald Trump did to try to prevent full implementation of the Fair Housing Act. So there were many actions today combined with what he did last week. But Judy, this is not the end of what we intend to do. This is 6 days in. We have a great deal more to do on all aspects of equity and justice. The other thing I would mention is sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so for Americans watching this, what tangible changes are they going to see from this?
Well, the first and most important thing, and what President Biden spent a great deal of time today talking about, is we don't just invest in equity and racial justice out of moral purpose, as significant as that may be. We do it because it benefits every single American, not just one group or another. You know, there have been important studies that have been recently conducted by economists, including at Citi, which have indicated that if we can close the racial gap in income and opportunity, all Americans stand to benefit. We will add $5 trillion to the economy over 5 years and create 6 million new jobs for everybody. So this work is the business of making all Americans do better. Because when some of us are suffering and the gaps are so huge, it actually drags us all down. So what we will do that is different is to make sure that when we have new policies and programs, that we're thinking about how they can be beneficial broadly. So for example, in the President's American Rescue Plan, his COVID relief package, there are things in there that benefit all Americans, raising unemployment benefits and extending them, making sure that we have up to $2,000 to all those who need it. But there are many steps in there that will benefit those at the lower income scale and lift half of American children out of poverty and reduce overall poverty by 30%. So this is beneficial to everybody.
What do you say to some conservatives, like the columnist Andrew Sullivan, and I'm quoting from him. He's accusing the president, in one of the things he wrote, of culture war aggression. And he went on to say, the president's focus on equity, he said, would give named identity groups a specific advantage in treatment by the federal government over other groups.
What I would say to that is a false characterization of what is going on. We are not giving anybody an advantage. We're giving everybody an equal level playing field. Or that's what we aim to do. Because the history in this country is there has not been a level playing field for many Americans, not just of black and brown Americans and people of color, but people in rural areas who've been left behind, people in urban and suburban areas, disabled Americans, religious minorities, LGBTQ Americans. And the reality is it is holding us all back. So rather than look at this through a divisive prism of zero sum, if it's good for them, it has to be bad for me, That's not the American way, and that's not how we all grow and prosper. We have to recognize that we're in this boat together. We sink or swim together. And when we have a leak in the boat and people are at risk, it puts all of us at risk. So it's not about advantaging one group over another. It's making sure that we all begin at the same place and have the chance to fulfill our God-given potential.
I asked because Andrew Sullivan went on to say you don't unite the country by dividing it along what he calls these deep and inflammatory issues of identity.
Well,
and as you know, there are Republicans saying the focus on equity is pointing a finger at Republicans saying they are racist.
Well, that is absolutely not the case. And as President Biden said today, he believes, and most religions teach us, that we have to look out for one another, and that we believe that most Democrats, Republicans, and Independents believe that we are all human beings of equal dignity and equal worth, and we have to respect that. But it's a bit rich, frankly, for Republicans to suggest that by trying to lift up everybody, we are dividing America, when we just had 4 years of the most divisive, vitriolic presidency that one can imagine. And that division was a political strategy. And thankfully, it hasn't worked because it is not what the American people want. They want us to come together. They want us to value each other. They want us to find common ground. And contrary to the notion that somehow this divides us, by recognizing that we all have inherent dignity and worth, that we're all worthy of respect and opportunity, we're reaching out hands to one another and lifting each other up. That's the America that makes the American dream accessible to not just a few, but the many. And that's what we want to be.
One very brief final question. Will there be government funds that go into supporting these new policies?
Yes, absolutely. For example, in the COVID relief package, which we call the American Rescue Plan, there are funds in there for all Americans, but funds that will benefit people who have been left behind as well, and people of different backgrounds and races, of all backgrounds and races. But the reality is, yes, there will be money for child tax credits, for the earned income tax credits, for vaccines, so that we can get vaccines in everybody's arms, not just those with access to information and resources. And the COVID crisis is a perfect illustration of the fact that we are all in this boat together. We are not going to recover from this crisis if our essential workers, our frontline workers, from meat packers to restaurant workers to hospital workers, are suffering, because we all rely on them to keep our economy afloat and to keep our lives working. We need to get our kids all back in school. That's not a Democratic or Republican imperative. That's a national imperative. So this package and these resources serve us all. And we will make those investments because they are in our shared benefit and interest.
Susan Rice, who is President Biden's domestic policy advisor, I know we'll want to be checking in with you as the weeks and months go by to see how these policies are progressing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judy.
In the day's other news, the new Biden-run Justice Department rescinded the Trump administration's zero-tolerance border policy. It led to thousands of family separations. Separately, a federal judge in Texas temporarily blocked President Biden's 100-day ban on most deportations. The Republican Attorney General in Texas had challenged the ban. The world reached another grim marker today, 100 million confirmed cases of COVID-19. More than 2.1 million patients have died, including 900 survivors of the Nazi Holocaust who'd been living in Israel. Meanwhile, more vaccination sites in the U.S. are canceling appointments because of vaccine shortages. We'll focus on the vaccine problem after the news summary. A major storm blanketed parts of the Midwest with a foot or more of snow today. Communities in Nebraska and Iowa were buried under 15 inches, turning roads treacherous. The snow was expected to keep falling into the night. Last night, the system spawned a tornado north of Birmingham, Alabama. It killed a teenage boy, injured 30 people, and crushed buildings in its path. In India, thousands of farmers flooded New Delhi, protesting new laws they fear will benefit corporate farms. Leaders said that more than 10,000 tractors drove into the city, with farmers breaking barricades and battling police. They stormed the Red Fort, that dates from the 17th century, and insisted that the new laws be withdrawn.
The message for the Prime Minister is that it is not the Indian government, it is the farmers' government, and farmers will rule it. We will do as we want to. You cannot force your laws on the poor according to your whims.
The protest began nearly 2 months ago and had been largely peaceful. Back in this country, the interim head of the U.S. Capitol Police apologized for the failure to prevent the assault on the building on January 6th. She said officials did not deploy enough officers with adequate communications, despite warnings that extremists supporting President Trump planned violence. Widespread internet outages hit the Northeast today. Verizon reported problems with its service, possibly stemming from a cut fiber in New York. The disruption affected Google, Facebook, and other sites, and the many Americans now working from home. Wall Street had a lackluster day. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 23 points to close at 30,937. The Nasdaq fell about 10 points, and the S&P 500 slipped 5. And Baseball Hall of Famer Henry Aaron was memorialized in Atlanta today. Teammates, friends, and family gathered virtually and in person at the home stadium of his old team, the Atlanta Braves. They honored the home run king's legacy on and off the field. Aaron died on Friday at 86. Still to come on the NewsHour, COVID infections and deaths dip slightly, but the sluggish pace of inoculations remains a cause for concern. What is driving the protests in Russia in response to the imprisonment of the opposition leader? We discuss the vulnerabilities the U.S. faces with the former head of the government's cybersecurity agency, and much more.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
As we've reported, President Biden is trying to ramp up how quickly vaccines can be given to Americans and to increase the supply for this summer. That includes a plan to get 200 million more doses combined of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. From the outset, federal health officials have made vaccinating residents of long-term care facilities a priority. But as John Yang reports, more than a month into the campaign, there are concerns about how long that effort alone is taking.
Judy, to understand that priority, consider this. By one count, long-term care facilities, that's nursing homes and assisted living centers, account for about 6% of COVID cases, but 40% of virus-related deaths. And now some state officials are worried that vaccinations are moving on to other parts of the population before long-term care residents are inoculated. As of today, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says that 2.7 million doses have been administered at long-term care centers. That's about 11% of all doses nationwide. David Grabowski is a professor of healthcare policy at the Harvard Medical School. David, thanks so much for joining us. Given this, that everyone acknowledges this is a high-risk population in high-risk locations, the CDC says inoculating these people will save lives. Is this going fast enough?
I don't think, John, it's actually going fast enough. You cited the number in the introduction right there. Roughly 40% of the deaths occur in long-term care facilities. This is the population we need to protect We need to get this population and their caregivers vaccinated as quickly as possible. The 2.7 million vaccine doses, that sounds like a big number, but consider there are roughly 3 million individuals living in nursing homes and assisted living facilities. When you add their caregivers, you're up to about 5 million individuals that need to be vaccinated. Each of those individuals will need 2 doses. And so, yes, 2.7 is a big number, but it's probably just about 1/4 of the way there. And so we have a long ways to go in terms of vaccinating this population.
What are the hurdles to moving faster?
The hurdles are large. Unlike the general population, where you set up a vaccine clinic and the population goes to the clinic, here you have to bring the clinics to the long-term care facilities. And there are 30,000 nursing homes and assisted living facilities around the country. And so in order to get this population vaccinated, the federal government contracted with CVS and Walgreens. The good news is those are big companies, and in some states that process is working relatively well, but in other states it's going far too slow. And in a number of parts of the country, those companies only have so much bandwidth. They can only be in so many long-term care facilities per day. And so the process, John, is just moving too slow.
You say the bandwidth is just not wide enough. How do you solve that problem?
Sure. So by contracting with these 2 companies, CVS and Walgreens, they only have so many pharmacists and they only have the ability to be in so many nursing homes. It's actually interesting. The state that did the best in terms of vaccinating nursing home residents and their caregivers was West Virginia. The interesting thing about West Virginia, they opted out of the federal program. So they didn't work with CVS and Walgreens directly. They went ahead and contracted with a series of pharmacies in order to vaccinate residents and their caregivers. They did end up working with Walgreens, but a bunch of other local pharmacies as well. They got the National Guard involved. It was an all hands on deck approach, John, and it actually ended up working quite well. And they were first in the nation in terms of vaccinating nursing home residents.
Another issue we hear a lot about is the hesitancy of the staffers, the caregivers at these long-term care facilities to get the vaccine. How do you solve that?
This is a huge issue. So the numbers we're hearing, about half of all staff are getting vaccinated. So that's much lower than the number of residents. We're hearing about 85% of residents are choosing to get vaccinated, but far too few staff are getting vaccinated. Some facilities it's quite good, but some facilities it's 20-25% of staff. So we have a long way to go there. How do we get better? I think we need to change the narrative here. The approach to date by the federal government has been, let's provide more staff with information. That's very necessary. We do need to convince them that this vaccine is safe and effective. They're quite worried about side effects. They're quite worried about safety. But they're also quite distrustful of nursing home management and leadership. They're distrustful of the government. It's not just the message they're hearing, it's who they're hearing it from.
We're at a point where we're sort of turning a page. We have a new administration coming in, rethinking this whole thing. If you were to be advising the new Biden administration, what would you tell them?
I would tell them 3 things. First, we need to go faster. And CVS and Walgreens are doing a great job in some parts of the country, but it's going far too slow in others. Let's get other pharmacies involved in those areas of the country where things are moving too slowly. Second, we need to address staff hesitancy. The rates among staff are far too low. We need to not just provide them with information. We also need to change who's providing that information. We need to rely on relationships, and we need to build trust with staff in terms of messaging. And then finally, we've been flying blind. We have these national numbers on vaccine doses. We have very little information on the ground in terms of what's happening in facilities.
David Grabowski, professor of healthcare policy at the Harvard Medical School. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Part of today's call between President Biden and Russia's President Vladimir Putin centered on Russia's top opposition figure, Alexei Navalny. Nick Schifrin reports on how Navalny is sparking protests.
The protests rolled across 5,000 miles and 100 cities, from Yakutsk in the east, where the temperature was 60 below, to Moscow in the west, a national wave of dissent and defiance.
We are here because we are fed up with the regime in this country. Putin is a thief, and the whole system is corrupt.
Police responded with blunt force and arrested more than 3,000 protesters. But if that brutalness was par for the course, protesters' resistance with their hands and snowballs was a sign Russians have had it, and they're willing to defy their government more than they have in many years. They answer the call from opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Last week in Moscow, after a hug from his wife, he live-streamed his arrest upon arrival from Berlin, where he'd recuperated from an attempted assassination that independent researchers say was launched by the Russian government.
There are 20 million beggars in the country, and he buys a yacht for his mistress.
Navalny's call coincided with a new investigative video that crosses what used to be red lines, Putin's love life, and what Navalny called extravagant personal corruption in a billion-dollar palace, filled with opulent rooms and disparaging Putin as a wannabe monarch. The video's been viewed more than 90 million times, allowing Navalny to circumvent state-run media and maintain massive influence. Putin almost never mentions Navalny, but an online forum this week denied Navalny's charges.
Nothing of what is listed there as my property belongs or has ever belonged to me or my close relatives. Never.
He's a kind of a czar and autocrat.
In 2012, our Margaret Warner interviewed Navalny with an interpreter. That's when Navalny started his campaign, calling Putin's party the party of crooks and thieves. Navalny predicted Putin would end up like Muammar Gaddafi. We followed him again during his campaign for president in 2017.
They tell us, you, and we have to say, oh, okay, we're very sorry. But no, we have gathered here to say we are going to ask these questions and we will obtain the answers.
His leadership has especially galvanized young Russians, who posted videos this weekend removing Putin portraits.
And to discuss this moment in Russia, we turn to Masha Gessen, staff writer for The New Yorker and author of 11 books. Masha Gessen, welcome back to the NewsHour. Are these protests different from previous protests in Russia?
Yes and no. They are bigger. It is particularly significant that they're bigger. I mean, they don't involve, more cities than, for example, the protests in 2011, 2012. But there is a significant difference in the sense that the protests in 2011, 2012 took place under much safer conditions for the protesters. They were, quote unquote, legal in the eyes of the state. And the sanctions for any kind of violations that might have been committed during the protests were much lighter. In the last decade, Russia has passed a slew of laws aimed specifically at intimidating any kind of protest. And these protests were explicitly declared illegal by the state. So every single person, every one of the tens of thousands of people who came out, knew that they were risking arrest. It's part of a long wave of dissatisfaction, distrust, and kind of a slow building refusal to take it anymore.
How much of a threat are these protests to Putin? We have not seen what we've seen in previous examples in Russian history, and even in 2011, 2012, which are the elites breaking from Putin. So does that mean that these are not a threat to the Kremlin?
The Putin regime is a mafia state. Every single person in the elites is personally dependent on Putin for money and power. That's one of the reasons, for example, that they all contributed to the building of his palace, right? He has them in his grip at all times. So we're not going to see the elites coalescing against Putin. That kind of analysis is not applicable to this kind of regime. Unfortunately for the protesters, there are no levers in any existing institutions for the protesters to activate. There's no independent judiciary, there's no parliament, there are even no elites that could rise up against Putin. The protests, I think, are probably best and, both sort of hopefully and pessimistically viewed as an investment in Russia's post-Putin future, which will eventually happen.
Navalny is playing what a colleague of yours called digital guerrilla war. He's clearly popular with younger Russians and clearly able to get a viral video out there. But the majority of Russia is older, politically inactive. Can Navalny reach out to the actual majority of the country?
Russia doesn't have elections. Russia doesn't have any kind of traditional media sphere that would allow a politician to reach out to a majority of the population. That said, Navalny has kind of hacked that predicament. In the scorched earth political environment of Russia, he has nonetheless been able to establish himself as a viable alternative to Putin, as a different kind of politician and a different kind of politics.
And finally, U.S.-Russia relations. Biden and Putin spoke today. Biden's made it clear they're going to try and work together on issues like New START, while challenging Putin on other issues, including Navalny. But the Russians, meanwhile, continue to question Biden's legitimacy as president. Will Russia seek to cause more disruption in the U.S., do you think, while Biden waits for his national security team to be confirmed?
Joe Biden is the first president since the end of the Cold War who has not promised, he has not postulated as a goal any kind of normalization or improvement of relations with Russia, right? We know that the reality of the situation is that nothing good is going to happen in the relationship between these two countries, and Biden is not even sort of signaling that this is an ambition of his, which I think is a good sign, just because it's good to see the president telling the truth. Nothing good is going to come of this relationship. Is Russia going to continue to meddle in U.S. politics if the U.S. lets it? I've never been of the school that Donald Trump was elected by Russia. I think that he was elected by Americans, and Russians were able to fortuitously sort of whip up some sentiment. If there are things for Russians to get involved in, if there are things for Russians to whip up, if we continue to be a divided, conflicted country in which nearly half the population is entirely unmoored from reality, that's fertile ground. But that's on us. That's not on Russia.
Masha Gessen, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Of the many threats facing the Biden administration, cybersecurity remains a constant concern. William Brangham explores how a recent massive attack is still with us.
The Russian government is believed to be behind the so-called SolarWinds attack. It was revealed back in December, but since then, the number of federal agencies and companies that were victimized by this hack have continued to grow, and that's raised concerns about what kinds of sensitive data might have been compromised. One person who's been hired to assess that damage is Christopher Krebs. He was the former director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. He was fired by President Trump shortly after he called the 2020 election, which he helped protect, quote, the most secure in U.S. history. He's now a partner at the Krebs Stamos Group. Chris Krebs, great to have you back on the NewsHour. This hack has been described as one of the most sophisticated cyber espionage attacks against the U.S. in recent history. Your firm has been hired by SolarWinds, the software company that was a victim of this intrusion and then led to subsequent intrusions. Do you share the belief that this was the Russians behind this attack?
So certainly, even before I was brought in by the new CEO to help them both understand the nature of the compromise, the hack, but also how to build a leading edge security program inside SolarWinds, it was obvious to, I think, most of the cybersecurity vendors and companies out there, as well as what I had heard and was hearing from the national security community, that this was very likely, if not certainly, a Russian espionage campaign tied to what's known as the SVR, which is their intelligence, their foreign intelligence service. And again, it's got all the hallmarks of just quiet, patient, deliberate, very well planned and executed, and they showed, in fact, a good deal of restraint in how they executed, which is not always the tradecraft of some of the other Russian cyber actors.
I mean, so many of our federal agencies were victims of this, many companies. Do you have a sense of what the Russians were after, what they took?
If it is, in fact, an espionage campaign, again, I think that seems to be the general consensus. They're very likely looking for information on diplomatic negotiations, economic negotiations, national security conversations and policy making that the Russians would be interested in, including things like chemical weapons and things of that nature. So I do believe that they were pecking around looking for relevant information to the Kremlin and the Russian government leadership. But they did so in a quiet and deliberate way, and they had a priority list by what I understand. And so I think when we get to the bottom of this one, it's certainly a very concerning compromise at the federal government, but it may be fairly targeted in terms of how they actually accessed and executed.
We know that the Biden administration has launched a full review of this hack. Do you have a sense of the things that they ought to be doing that might not have been done thus far?
Well, I think we're going to have probably something along the lines of a national commission on the broader campaign that the Russians launched. I suspect that there will be a number of companies that were impacted or compromised similar to SolarWinds. We have to continue advancing the cybersecurity posture of our federal agencies. And that's not just about buying more cybersecurity tools. We have to have modern systems in place. We have to have a meaningful governance structure in place where someone in a position of authority like a national cyber director or my old agency, CISA, is able to meaningfully engage in direct action within the civilian agencies that unfortunately to this day still are left a little bit too much on their own.
I want to turn lastly to the election. As you well know, you worked very hard to secure this election, and by all measures, that was a success. But the former president and many members of the GOP don't buy that. They argue that there was widespread fraud. The former president said that this election was stolen. I'm just curious, as someone whose job was not just to secure elections infrastructure, but also to bat down false facts, how do we as a nation wrestle with this ocean of misinformation?
So first off, we need those that propagated the big lie that the election was stolen. They need to own up to their lies, or they need to be held accountable. And one way for the president is through impeachment and conviction. I think that needs to continue moving forward for a few reasons. First is that, I've said it before, but you don't get mulligans in insurrection and trying to overthrow an election. There have to be meaningful consequences, or someone a little bit more dedicated, a little bit more competent may try it again and unfortunately next time be successful. We also have to send a clear message to our allies that we have governance mechanisms here in the U.S. to ensure that our democracy is stable. And lastly, to dictators across the world that may try to meddle here or elsewhere, we're not going to tolerate it, and that there will be consequences. But beyond that, we have to continue from a transparency perspective, educating the American people on how elections actively work. And I think that's in part what happened in the last year or so, is that some of the promoters of the big lie took advantage of the fact that the machinery of elections is not always immediately apparent to the American people. So let's do something about that. I love the idea of bringing back Schoolhouse Rock and how do we educate on civics but beyond that, actually meaningfully investing in elections, eradicating some of the outdated systems and truly meaningful post-election audits.
All right, here's to more Schoolhouse Rock. Christopher Krebs, former director of CISA, great to have you back on the NewsHour.
Thanks, William.
One area hit by COVID is higher education. According to our partners at USA Facts, 36% of households cancel plans for higher education due to the pandemic as of last month. But there's one area of growth, short-term programs to develop skills for the workforce quickly. Hari Srinivasan reports in this last chapter of our series, Rethinking College.
When I was in Africa, I was going to college and the terrorists attacked my country and they destroyed everything.
When Amina Abdullahi came to study in the U.S. from the West African nation of Niger, she had a big goal, become a computer scientist, a PhD no less. Only problem?
I didn't know anything about computers. I couldn't even use Microsoft, the basic that even middle school people use to submit homework.
A big obstacle, especially since she also didn't speak English. But Amina has always had a strategy for getting what she wants. She takes things one step at a time.
This year I will learn English. Next year I will do my GED. Next year I will start college.
In just 4 years, Abdullahi is already working here, Wall Street. She's enrolled in a program called Year Up and interning at the financial information firm S&P Global. All that without a single day of college. Short-term credentials have been around for decades, but in this economic environment, with skyrocketing traditional college costs now beyond the reach of many, they're having a moment. In just a few months, Abdullahi began working toward a certificate in UX, or User Experience Design. That certificate can be applied toward a degree in the future, but in the meantime, it will help her escape minimum wage jobs.
And actually allow me to even having a good job, and then I can pay for more education to get more skill done. If only I started with college, I would have to wait 4 years to even have entry-level job in corporate America.
She needs to have economic stability, right?
That's why Gerald Chertavian, the founder and CEO of Year Up, made short-term credentials a key part of his program to give low-income young people a leg up in the job market. As the U.S. economy looks beyond the pandemic, he says, students like Abdullahi will be desperately needed to fix a fundamental supply and demand problem in the U.S.
Well, on the supply side, we have 5 million young adults who are out of school, out of work, and don't have more than a high school degree. And on the demand side, we have literally millions of jobs for, let's say, technical jobs, jobs that are require a certain level of skill that are going unfulfilled, and that'll get worse rather than better as we recover from the pandemic.
The pandemic destroyed millions of American jobs for all ages. A third of adults say that if they lost their job, they would need more education to get a new one. And given that lower-income workers have been hit the hardest, they'll need to get them quickly, cheaply, and in skills tied directly to available jobs.
When we're looking at the different sutures,
Schools like Columbus State Community College had been working to ramp up shorter-term credential programs for years. Then came COVID-19. Cheryl Hay is Columbus State's Executive Director of the Office of Talent Strategy.
It's going to become a cornerstone for us because it's about equity and opportunity. Not everyone can stop what they're doing to go to class full-time during the day. And so shorter programming that kind of helps them stair-step a little at a time is where we really meet the need.
About 36 million people have completed some college coursework but didn't finish, often leaving their efforts completely unrecognized once they drop out. But now, even big tech wants to drive part of the solution.
We actually co-created the certificate with Amazon
through the command line interface.
After just 4 classes at Santa Monica College, a student like Sophia Baca can earn an industry-recognized certificate in cloud computing skills.
Even if I'm not completed with the 4 classes, I know that there are employers who are willing to hire me as I'm finishing the program.
Those jobs often come with paychecks between $50,000 and $80,000 per year. Patricia Ramos is the school's Dean of Workforce and Economic Development. She says too few or underemployed workers realize how quickly they can retrain in today's high-tech job landscape.
Not everybody is going to need bachelor's degrees and master's degree and graduate degrees. I think that industries like tech are changing so quickly, right? They say every 6 months, and now it's even faster.
Google recently developed its own short-term career certificates they say will be viewed internally as the equivalent of a 4-year degree. So, could short-term credentials really replace college? For some perspective, I called Jane Oates, the president of Working Nation and a former Obama administration official in the Department of Labor.
If people get the right ones, if they get valuable industry-recognized credentials, they can get a job pretty quickly.
How does that change the landscape when people are starting to see their neighbors saying, wait a minute, I went to school for 4 years and this person over here just went for 6 months and we're kind of at the same job?
Well, I think the pandemic could set post-secondary education on its ear because people are really going to look at, is it worth it for me to go for a 2-year or a 4-year degree, or do these quick credentials that are industry recognized get me a quicker bang for my buck?
But she warns there are thousands of certificates out there. Not all were created equal.
People have been scammed in the past, so people should be very careful when they're selecting a program. Make sure that that credential is recognized by other employers.
Yes.
Amina Abdullahi will soon graduate the Year Up program and is already working towards 2 certificates.
Every day I said, I deserve to work in corporate America, I deserve to have skills, I deserve to add values, I deserve to do something better for my life.
She'll keep repeating that, she says, one credential at a time until she makes it. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Hari Srinivasan in New York.
Such an important series. Thank you. And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Thank you. Please stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by Consumer Cellular, Johnson & Johnson, BNSF Railway, Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and the advancement of international peace and security at carnegie.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.